The loudest machine on my property was not the one that almost destroyed my barn. It was the one that woke me up to the biggest lie I had ever been told. The deep growl of a diesel engine rolled across my ranch before the sun had fully climbed above the oak trees. I opened my front door expecting to see one of my neighbors hauling feed or moving cattle, but instead I found a yellow bulldozer parked less than 50 feet from the old red barn my grandfather had built more than 40 years earlier. Fresh orange survey stakes stretched across the pasture like someone had stitched a new property line through the middle of my family's history overnight. The smell of diesel fuel drifted through the cool Texas morning while dew still clung to the grass beneath my boots. 3 contractors stood beside the machine holding clipboards and steaming paper coffee cups. None of them looked comfortable. One of them finally nodded toward me and quietly said they were waiting for final authorization before beginning any work. I never answered. My attention was fixed on a woman standing beside a spotless white sport utility vehicle at the end of my gravel driveway. Linda Prescott, the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, held a thick folder beneath one arm and wore the calm expression of someone convinced the outcome had already been decided. She walked toward me without hesitation and handed me another certified notice. According to the documents inside, I had been fined $48,000 because my barn supposedly violated association setback requirements. Their newly commissioned land survey claimed part of the structure crossed on a property controlled by the Homeowners Association. Unless I paid the fine and removed the offending portion of the building, additional penalties would continue accumulating every day. I slowly folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope without saying a word. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 42 years old, and everything surrounding that barn had belonged to my family long before the subdivision behind Linda's shoulder even existed. My grandfather cut the original timber. My father replaced the roof after a violent hailstorm years ago. I learned to drive a tractor beside those weathered walls before I was old enough to reach the pedals without sitting on a folded blanket. That barn was not simply another building on a map. It was the center of every memory that had shaped my life. Linda continued explaining deadlines, compliance procedures, and possible legal consequences, but her voice gradually faded beneath the steady rumble of the bulldozer. Something else had caught my attention. Near the eastern corner of the barn, hidden beneath brittle grass and years of undisturbed soil, a small rusted piece of iron barely reflected the morning sunlight. Most people would have walked past it without noticing. I could not stop looking at it. My father once told me that land remembered the truth even when people forgot it, and he always pointed toward old survey monuments whenever he said those words. Standing there between the bulldozer and my family's barn, I had no idea whether that forgotten marker still mattered. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Buildings do not quietly move across property lines after standing in exactly the same place for decades. Somewhere beneath polished reports, expensive surveys, and confident speeches, the truth was still buried in the same ground my family had trusted for generations. My grandfather, Harold Walker, never believed a building should exist simply because it was useful. He believed every structure should earn its place by serving the people who depended on it. That old red barn had done exactly that for more than 4 decades before anyone questioned where it stood. My earliest memories lived inside those weathered wooden walls. I remembered climbing onto stacked hay bales that seemed taller than mountains when I was 6 years old. I remembered the smell of fresh-cut cedar mixing with machine oil while my father repaired tractors late into the evening. Every winter the wind whistled softly through tiny gaps in the siding, and every summer the metal roof echoed beneath heavy Texas rain before the familiar scent of damp timber filled the entire building. To anyone driving past, it looked like an ordinary ranch barn. To my family, it was where birthdays were celebrated after long harvest days, where broken equipment was repaired, where storms were waited out together, and where every generation learned that hard work mattered more than comfort. My father rarely spoke about himself, but he constantly talked about responsibility. Every Saturday morning he handed me a shovel, a hammer, or a wrench before I had finished breakfast. While we repaired fences or cleaned stalls, he explained that land never lied. Paper could be rewritten. Maps could be redrawn. Opinions changed with elections and new developments. The land stayed exactly where it had always been. Whenever we walked the eastern edge of the property, He paused beside patches of tall grass where old survey monuments rested beneath the soil. He never disturbed them. He simply pointed toward the ground and reminded me that those forgotten pieces of iron carried more truth than any argument ever could. At the time, I thought he was simply respecting old surveying traditions. Years later, I understood he had been protecting the history of our family without even realizing it. After graduating from college, I became a civil engineer because I enjoyed solving problems with measurements instead of assumptions. For nearly 15 years, I worked on bridges, drainage systems, and public infrastructure throughout Texas. Every project reinforced the same lesson my father had taught me as a child. Good decisions begin with accurate measurements. Eventually, when my father's health declined, I returned home to manage the ranch full-time. I never considered it a sacrifice. Walking back through the familiar barn doors every morning felt like returning to the place where my life had always belonged. I repaired the roof when storms damaged it, reinforced aging support beams, replaced broken fencing, and cared for the property exactly as my father and grandfather had done before me. Nothing about the ranch had moved. The gravel driveway followed the same gentle curve. The oak trees cast the same afternoon shadows across the pasture. The barn stood in precisely the same place where generations of my family had worked, laughed, and built their lives together. That was why the documents resting inside the certified envelope felt impossible to believe. Every measurement printed across those polished survey pages contradicted everything I had experienced with my own eyes for decades. As I looked across the pasture that morning, my father's words quietly returned once again. If the measurements on paper disagreed with the measurements preserved by the land itself, then somewhere between those two stories, someone had measured from the wrong beginning. Linda Prescott believed organization solved every problem. She dressed with careful precision, spoke with measured confidence, and rarely raised her voice because she never thought she needed to. As president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, she carried herself like someone whose decisions naturally became everyone else's responsibility. The subdivision behind my ranch had expanded rapidly over the previous decade. What had once been open pasture gradually transformed into quiet streets lined with identical mailboxes, decorative stone entrances, perfectly trimmed lawns, and freshly planted maple trees. I never objected to the neighborhood. People had every right to build homes beside my family's ranch. I simply expected the same respect for land that had existed long before the first sidewalk was poured. My first conversation with Linda happened not long after I returned home permanently. She drove through my entrance in a spotless white sport utility vehicle, carrying a welcome basket and introducing herself with a warm smile. She complimented the peaceful view, admired the century-old oak trees, and politely mentioned that many homeowners appreciated attractive neighboring properties because they helped maintain community value. I thanked her, accepted the basket, and believed the conversation had ended pleasantly. Looking back, I realized she had spent more time studying my barn than enjoying the scenery. Several weeks later, the first letter arrived. It suggested that repainting the barn would improve the appearance visible from newer homes. I respectfully declined because the weathered red exterior had been part of our ranch for generations. Another letter followed recommending that sections of my traditional ranch fencing be replaced with materials that better reflected the neighborhood's visual standards. I responded by providing copies of county agricultural exemptions confirming that the fencing complied with every applicable regulation. Then another notice questioned farm equipment parked beside the barn, followed by another expressing concern about the building's proximity to the developing subdivision. Each envelope sounded polite, but each request reached farther beyond the association's authority than the one before it. I answered every concern calmly with permits, photographs, county records, and property documents. For several months, everything became quiet again, and I assumed common sense had settled the matter. Then an invitation arrived requesting my attendance at the next Homeowners Association board meeting. The clubhouse smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new paint when I walked inside. Framed photographs of award-winning landscaping decorated the walls while board members quietly organized neatly prepared binders across polished tables. Linda welcomed everyone with practiced confidence before projecting a large aerial map onto the front screen. My ranch appeared beside the subdivision, but something immediately caught my attention. A bold red property line crossed directly through the eastern corner of my pasture. Linda explained that the association had recently commissioned an updated professional land survey, which indicated that part of my family's barn extended onto association property. Several board members calmly nodded while turning pages that had clearly been prepared well before I entered the room. I asked whether anyone had compared the new measurements with the original county surveys recorded before the subdivision existed. Linda smiled politely and explained that the updated survey represented the current interpretation of the boundary. Around the room, heads nodded again. I looked from the colorful map to the faces surrounding the table and realized that everyone believed the printed lines more than the ground they had never bothered to examine. The pressure that followed the board meeting did not arrive all at once. It settled over my ranch a little more each day until every ordinary morning carried a quiet sense of uncertainty. 2 days after the meeting, I walked outside before sunrise with a bucket of feed and immediately noticed bright orange paint sprayed across the grass near the eastern side of the barn. Thin wooden stakes connected by fluorescent strings stretched across the pasture in a perfectly straight line, cutting through the land as though someone had already decided the argument had been settled. The sharp smell of fresh marking paint mixed with damp earth while the first rays of sunlight reflected from the faded metal roof above me. I stood there for several minutes without moving, trying to understand how a place that had never changed could suddenly become unfamiliar because of lines drawn on a map. Before noon, another white pickup truck slowly rolled into my driveway. The doors opened, and 3 contractors stepped out carrying measuring wheels, clipboards, and rolled construction drawings. Their expressions were polite but hesitant. One of them explained they had only been hired to prepare a cost estimate in case the association received approval to require changes to the structure. He admitted no final order had been issued, but they wanted to be ready if enforcement continued. His honesty made the conversation even heavier. Complete strangers were estimating the cost of dismantling part of a barn my grandfather had built before anyone had proven it stood in the wrong place. During the following week, another notice appeared on the community website describing an ongoing property compliance matter involving an agricultural structure near the eastern edge of Willow Creek Estates. The address was never listed, yet everyone nearby understood exactly which property the notice described. At the local feed store, familiar conversations became noticeably quieter whenever I walked inside. One neighbor suggested I should settle quickly because legal disputes rarely ended well for individual property owners. Another quietly told me that challenging a homeowners association usually became more expensive than simply giving in. Nobody intended to discourage me, but every opinion added another layer of pressure. I visited the county records office hoping someone could immediately identify the mistake. The clerk treated me with kindness and helped locate archived plats, tax records, and previous filings, but she also explained that the newest survey appeared properly recorded and professionally certified. Official paperwork often carried significant weight unless another licensed survey demonstrated a measurable error. I thanked her and left carrying copies of historical records beneath my arm while questions continued filling my mind. Every afternoon, another certified envelope seemed to appear inside my mailbox repeating deadlines, additional penalties, and possible legal consequences if compliance was delayed. I pinned each notice above the old workbench inside the barn beside faded family photographs and my father's worn leather gloves. The bright white paper looked strangely fragile against rough wooden boards that had survived countless storms without complaint. That evening, I walked the eastern fence line exactly as my father had done for years. Dry grass brushed against my boots while cicadas filled the warm Texas air and the last golden light settled across the pasture. Near an overgrown corner where the grass had not been disturbed in years, I paused beside the place my father always seemed to notice without explaining why. Looking down at the uneven ground, I remembered his quiet words about old survey markers telling the truth long after people stopped listening. And for the first time, I wondered whether the answer had been waiting beneath my feet the entire time. By the beginning of the second week, I finally admitted something I had been trying to avoid. No amount of determination could replace a licensed opinion backed by law. I scheduled a meeting with a respected real estate attorney whose office overlooked the county courthouse. The conference room smelled faintly of polished oak and old paper, while shelves filled with thick legal reference books surrounded us on every side. I spread everything I had collected across the large wooden table, original property deeds, county tax records, historical plats, family photographs showing the barn through different decades. Every certified letter the homeowners association had mailed to me. The attorney examined each document carefully, comparing old legal descriptions against the newly filed survey without rushing. The room remained almost silent except for the slow turning of paper and the steady ticking of a wall clock. After nearly an hour, he placed his reading glasses on the table and looked directly at me. He said my ownership records appeared remarkably consistent, but the association's survey had also been prepared by a licensed professional. If we wanted to challenge it successfully, we would need stronger evidence than personal memories or historical photographs. We needed physical proof connected directly to the original boundary itself. He explained that original survey monuments, county control points, and professionally verified field measurements carried tremendous weight because they established where the legal description actually began. I thanked him, gathered my documents, and drove back toward the ranch with more clarity than disappointment. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the highway while warm air carried the familiar scent of dry grass through my open truck window. I realized I was no longer searching for someone to rescue me. I was searching for the place where the truth had first been measured. When I reached home, another certified envelope waited inside my mailbox repeating payment deadlines and warning that additional penalties would continue accumulating. I pinned it beside the others above my old workbench inside the barn, where bright white paper contrasted sharply against weathered timber darkened by generations of honest work. As evening settled across the pasture, I returned to the overgrown corner my father had always treated with quiet respect. Kneeling carefully, I brushed away loose dirt with my hand until my fingers touched something cold and solid beneath the grass. A rusted iron cap slowly emerged from the earth. Years of soil had hidden most of it, yet faint stamped markings remained visible beneath the corrosion. My heart did not race. Instead, an unexpected calm settled over me because I immediately recognized what I was looking at. My father had shown me similar monuments when I was young, explaining they were never placed by accident and should never be disturbed without good reason. I carefully photographed the marker from every angle before comparing its location with the association's survey map. The printed boundary and the monument refused to agree. Standing there beneath the fading Texas sky, I reached for my phone and called Daniel Brooks, a licensed land surveyor whose family had spent generations surveying ranches across the state. After listening quietly to my description, he asked only one question. Had anyone moved the monument? When I told him it remained exactly where I found it, he paused for a moment before answering with calm confidence. Leave everything exactly as it is. I will be there first thing tomorrow morning. Daniel Brooks arrived just after sunrise in an older white pickup truck carrying the kind of equipment I recognized from my years as a civil engineer. Aluminum tripods, satellite receivers, measuring poles, weatherproof instrument cases, and carefully organized field notebooks filled the truck bed with quiet purpose instead of unnecessary showmanship. He stepped out, shook my hand, and walked directly toward the survey monument without asking another question. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp grass, while sunlight slowly spread across the faded red walls of the barn. Daniel crouched beside the rusted iron cap and gently brushed away another thin layer of dirt with a small nylon brush. He studied the worn markings for several minutes before opening one of his reference books. The only sounds around us came from distant cattle, singing meadowlarks, and the occasional electronic tone from his survey receiver as satellites locked into position high above the ranch. He finally stood and looked toward me with calm confidence. He explained that the monument appeared to be an original county survey marker installed decades before the subdivision had ever been developed. That alone did not automatically settle the dispute, but it gave us the correct place to begin measuring. We spent the rest of the morning moving carefully across the pasture. Daniel established control points, verified distances from multiple directions, and repeated every measurement until each result matched perfectly. Nothing was rushed. Every number was recorded twice before becoming part of the official field notes. After lunch, we compared those measurements with historical county plats, original property deeds, engineering benchmarks, archived aerial photographs, and tax parcel records that I had collected during the previous week. One transparent overlay after another settled across the tailgate of my truck until a clear pattern slowly emerged. The original monument agreed with every historical document. The fence line built by my grandfather matched the recorded legal description. The old drainage ditch followed the same property boundaries shown on county maps dating back decades. Even the barn itself occupied exactly the same position in every aerial photograph taken over the years. Only the newer survey commissioned by the Homeowners Association failed to align with the original evidence. Daniel carefully explained what had happened. The newer survey appeared to begin from a more recent subdivision reference point instead of the original county monument. That single mistake shifted every subsequent measurement several feet away from the true boundary. The calculations looked professional because each measurement was internally consistent, but the entire survey had been built upon the wrong starting point. It was like drawing a perfect straight line from the wrong location. Late that afternoon, Daniel completed one final verification before closing his field notebook. He rested a hand on the weathered survey monument and quietly smiled. He said this small piece of iron had been telling the same story for decades while everyone else argued above it. Hearing those words lifted a weight I had carried since the first certified letter arrived in my mailbox. For the first time, I no longer felt like a ranch owner defending memories against paperwork. I had measurable evidence, supported by licensed surveying methods, historical records, and the original monument itself. As the golden Texas sunlight settled across the barn roof, I realized the land had never changed its story. We had finally measured it from the place where the truth had always begun. Daniel Brooks did not celebrate after completing the survey. He simply returned to the tailgate of his pickup truck, opened his field notebook, and began organizing every measurement with the same patience he had shown throughout the entire day. Watching him work reminded me that winning this case would never depend on emotion. It would depend on whether every number, every document, and every photograph could withstand careful examination. For the next several days, my ranch became a temporary survey office. Large aerial photographs covered the workbench inside the barn. Original county plats rested beside transparent overlays. My grandfather's faded property deed lay next to satellite measurements printed from Daniel's equipment. The familiar smell of old timber mixed with fresh printer ink and black coffee as we worked from sunrise until late evening without wasting a single hour. Daniel verified every coordinate again before preparing his final report. He compared historical benchmarks against current satellite positioning, confirmed each property corner from multiple control points, and documented the original survey monument with detailed photographs, precise measurements, and written observations. Nothing was left to assumption. Every conclusion could be traced back to physical evidence resting on the land itself. My attorney returned to the ranch 2 days later carrying several empty binders. Together we assembled the case in the same order the evidence had revealed itself. The original deed came first. County plats followed. Historical aerial photographs showed the barn standing in exactly the same location decade after decade. Tax parcel records matched the legal description. Daniel's licensed survey tied every measurement back to the original monument buried beneath the eastern pasture. Finally, the association survey was placed beside the completed report, allowing the difference between the two to become immediately visible. The attorney slowly closed the final binder and looked across the table. He smiled for the first time since we had met. He explained that we were no longer asking anyone to believe my memories. We were presenting measurable facts supported by independent records created across several decades. A formal request for a county hearing was submitted that same afternoon, along with Daniel's complete survey package and every supporting exhibit. The hearing date arrived more quickly than I expected. Meanwhile, the Homeowners Association continued acting as though nothing had changed. Another certified letter arrived repeating previous demands and reminding me that additional penalties would continue accumulating until compliance was achieved. Linda Prescott remained publicly confident, telling homeowners during a board meeting that the association expected a favorable outcome because its survey had been prepared by licensed professionals. I never responded. There was nothing left to argue about in parking lots, online discussions, or neighborhood conversations. Every evening, I walked through the barn before locking the heavy iron latch, listening to its familiar metallic click echo softly through the weathered wooden walls. Outside, the The bulldozer still sat beyond the pasture, waiting for instructions that had not yet arrived. The orange survey stakes remained planted across the grass, but they no longer unsettled me. I understood something I had not fully appreciated when this dispute began. Confidence built on assumptions can sound convincing for a while, but confidence built on verified evidence never needs to speak loudly. The land had already answered every important question. All that remained was placing those answers before people willing to measure the truth from the place where it had always begun. The county hearing began on a quiet Tuesday morning beneath bright Texas sunlight that poured through the tall windows of the administrative building. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood, fresh coffee, and old paper as attorneys, surveyors, and property owners quietly waited for their names to be called. Linda Prescott arrived carrying a thick leather binder filled with carefully organized documents. Several homeowners association board members followed close behind her, speaking confidently, as though the outcome had already been decided before anyone entered the room. Their attorney arranged enlarged survey maps across the conference table, while a professional presentation displayed crisp property lines, setback measurements, and certification stamps on a large screen. Every page appeared polished. Every chart looked convincing. Sitting quietly beside my attorney, I reminded myself that appearances had almost cost my family its barn once already. Daniel Brooks entered carrying only a weathered field case and 3 neatly labeled binders. He greeted the hearing officer politely before placing the original survey monument photographs, historical plats, aerial photographs, certified field notes, and licensed survey report onto the evidence table. Nothing about his presentation felt dramatic. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who trusted measurements more than opinions. The association presented its case first. Linda explained that the board had acted responsibly to protect community property and enforce recorded boundaries established by a professionally prepared survey. Their consultant described modern measurement techniques and confidently stated that the disputed structure extended beyond the lawful property line. When they finished, the hearing officer turned toward Daniel and invited him to respond. Daniel stood, opened the first binder, and began at the only place he believed every property dispute should begin. He introduced the original county monument, followed by the legal description recorded decades before the subdivision existed. One by one, he connected each piece of evidence to the next. Original deeds matched the county plats. Historical aerial photographs showed the barn occupying the identical location year after year. Engineering benchmarks aligned with the monument. Satellite measurements confirmed every recorded boundary. Finally, he placed the association survey beside the completed historical record. The difference became immediately visible. Daniel calmly explained that the newer survey had established its measurements from a more recent subdivision reference point, instead of the original county monument, shifting every subsequent calculation several feet away from the legally established boundary. The hearing officer leaned forward, studying each exhibit carefully before asking the association survey consultant whether the original monument had been incorporated into the newer field work. After a long pause, the consultant quietly acknowledged that it had not. Silence settled across the hearing room. The hearing officer reviewed the remaining documents for several minutes before reading the written decision. The enforcement action was dismissed in its entirety. Every assessed fine was withdrawn. The disputed boundary presented by the Homeowners Association was rejected because the overwhelming weight of historical records, licensed survey evidence, and the original county monument established the lawful property line beyond reasonable question. The officer further recommended that the association obtain a corrected survey before pursuing any future enforcement involving neighboring properties. Linda lowered her eyes toward the table without saying a word. No raised voices filled the room. No celebration interrupted the decision. The truth simply occupied the space where assumptions had stood only moments earlier. And for the first time since this dispute began, I felt the full weight of uncertainty quietly leave my shoulders. When I turned onto my gravel driveway later that afternoon, I noticed something I had not experienced in weeks. Silence. The bulldozer was gone. The contractors had packed their equipment. The orange survey stakes had disappeared from the pasture, and only faint tire marks remained in the dry Texas soil where heavy machinery had once waited for permission to erase part of my family's history. I stepped out of my truck and stood quietly beside the old barn, listening to sounds that had always belonged there. A gentle breeze moved through the oak trees. Cattle wandered peacefully across the pasture. The familiar metallic creak of the weather vane turned slowly above the roof while a meadowlark sang somewhere beyond the eastern fence. Nothing about the land had changed, yet everything felt different because the uncertainty was finally gone. Several days later, another certified envelope arrived in my mailbox, but this time I opened it without hesitation. Inside was an official notice from the Homeowners Association confirming that every assessed fine had been permanently withdrawn and that all enforcement actions involving my property had been canceled. The board also announced that an independent review of surrounding boundary records would be conducted to ensure future decisions reflected the original county surveys and legally established monuments. As the review progressed, additional discrepancies were discovered in several neighboring property maps, requiring corrections before future development plans could continue. One mistaken starting point had affected far more than my family's barn. Linda Prescott remained on the board for a short time after the hearing, but the atmosphere within the community quietly changed. Homeowners who had once accepted every recommendation without question began requesting supporting documents before approving major decisions. Survey reports received closer examination. Historical records were reviewed instead of ignored. Confidence alone no longer carried the same weight it once had. Nobody celebrated anyone's embarrassment, and no one needed to. Accountability had quietly replaced assumption. My own life slowly returned to the simple routine I had missed throughout the dispute. Every morning began with black coffee on the porch while sunlight spread across the pasture exactly as it always had. Every evening ended with the familiar metallic click of the heavy iron barn latch before I walked back toward the house beneath a sky filled with stars. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel Brooks stopped by while working nearby. Together we returned to the original survey monument, carefully cleaned away the remaining dirt around its weathered iron cap, and installed a modest protective marker so future surveyors would never overlook it again. Looking down at that small piece of iron resting quietly beneath the open Texas sky, I finally understood what my father had tried to teach me all those years ago. The monument had never argued. It had never demanded attention. It had simply remained exactly where honest hands had placed it decades earlier, patiently preserving the truth while maps changed, neighborhoods expanded, and confident opinions came and went. I rested one hand against the weathered barn wall and looked across the ranch my grandfather built, my father protected, and I had nearly lost because of one mistaken survey. In the end, the land never needed defending with anger or louder voices. It only needed someone willing to measure it from the place where the truth had always begun. That quiet lesson will remain with me every time I cross this pasture, because real justice is not created by authority. Real justice is uncovered by patience, protected by evidence, and remembered by the land long after every argument has finally come to an end.